Hello everyone, I'm Israel Lai and I'm incredibly honored to have the opportunity to present my musical composition and some thoughts on it at the Oxford Hong Kong Forum. So this talk will be mostly about my chamber opera, Bou6, which is a work that presents a local Hong Kong issue through a global lens of an opera. And I will be talking about how it does so. But first, a bit about myself. I graduated with an MPhil in music composition last year with a music portfolio and a dissertation on the song Glory to Hong Kong. Currently, I'm a freelance composer, I teach languages, and I run a podcast in Cantonese about language and linguistics. In the future, if the stars align, I will be continuing my studies on transculturalism in composition. That is how culture and cultural interactions are and can be reflected in the composition of new music. So today I'll be talking a bit about what the opera is, and afterwards I will talk about how I bridged a very local Hong Kong issue with a musical form that is increasingly global. And last but not least, I will be talking about what it means to have this issue presented through this perspective, through this form. And the core question is, what does this work mean for Hong Kong and how it does it? I will have to do a full disclosure because the goal of this work is not to resolve any conflicts, but to contribute to and provoke conversation between those who see it. So this talk will, in the same vein, be asking more questions than it gives answers. So, first of all, what is and what was Bou6? So it all starts with a relatively new society in Oxford called the Oxford Contemporary Opera Society. In June 2019, they had a call for composers for a project called Oxford Contemporary Opera Festival, which aims to put together 3 separate short operas that explore the possibilities of opera to reflect something that is relevant to the current age. I signed up for the call for composers, and this is important. In July 2019, I started drafting a proposal for my opera. Later on, I worked with a poet from Hong Kong to write the libretto, and in late 2019, I started working with predominantly European music directors and singers, performers to put this on stage. It was premiered in Oxford in the Jacqueline du Pré Music Building in November 2019. The same month of many very historically significant events, such as the siege of the Polytechnic University and the very important elections. So since I was writing the story in early July, it was very much inspired by events in Hong Kong leading up to the 1st of July, and in particular, the slogan that emerged on that day: "There is no right, only tyranny." More on that later. With this opera, I obviously am not making a film, but I wanted to document a certain perspective on these events and comment on them. And more importantly, I hoped to reduce these events into some very core conflicts and values and ideologies so that they can resonate equally with other societies and audiences. Because, as I wrote in a description of the opera, in every society, whether in the past, the present, or the future, there have been, there is, or there will be the same forces at play, the same sacrifices made, the same tyranny, the same revolutionaries, and the only difference is the outcome. So, because this is a 15-minute talk, it's impossible for us to watch a 30-minute opera. So I invite you cordially to come to my channel and watch the opera on your own, which is, as I said, 30 minutes and subtitled in English, French, and Cantonese. So what's the opera about? There are two main characters. One is called Riot, one is called Tyranny, as you might have guessed. You might notice that these are very abstract concepts instead of real people, as you would expect from a story like this. And that is intentional. And behind these two main characters, or maybe in front of them, are two equally abstract supporting characters. One is called The Departed, which is a number of people who have given their own lives to support a cause. And the other one is the Condemner, who represents a group of people who do nothing but condemn. And the whole opera basically outlines the rise of the idea of riot and what tyranny has to do with it. And it explores the question of how our perspectives and how the things we see are very much constrained by the stance that we take. So a quick synopsis of the three scenes and a short epilogue. The first scene introduces the departed and talks about her goals and her dreams and what she wants, and sets up the conflict between the departed and tyranny before the departed takes her own life. The second scene is introduces the condemner, who in a sense rejoices after the first departed departs, because he thinks that means everything is over. But the second scene also outlines the rise of the concept of riot, birthed out of the very same sacrifice. So initially he takes a seat at the side, but eventually he emerges, comes into full force, and riots, obviously. And third scene, in the initial concept of the opera, divides the stage into two sides with a barrier in between. So you can imagine how that relates to the events on the 1st of July, if you're up to date. So the right is initially on the other side than tyranny and condemner, but eventually he breaks through the barrier and comes into direct conflict with tyranny. At the end, it is shown that both sides have an equal level of violence, and that tells us that riot is not an inherent label, but it's something that tyranny slaps on the people that she disagrees with. It's just a label. And in the epilogue, tyranny sort of reflects on what happened, how she came up with the scapegoat of riot in order to justify the destruction that she herself has wrought. So now I'm going to talk about how this opera bridges or connects local issues with a genre of music that is European and increasingly global. But first of all, what's so special about opera? Well, compared to contemporary art music, it's unique form, because art music itself, in the contemporary times, it exists as an outgrowth of Western art music tradition. But nowadays, it's an increasingly global genre of music. Everyone around the world is aware of Western instruments. Everyone learns piano in a certain sense. And more people from different parts of the world are writing contemporary art music that relates to Western music tradition in a way, but incorporates different ideas and styles from their own cultures. So it's very much global. But contemporary opera, on the other hand, due to its requirement of lots of resources and budgets, it's most commonly only staged by large institutions, which limits it from being executed in societies where the tradition is less entrenched. So as a result, it has a very grand, very European image. And when you think about opera, you think about the lineage, the history of opera in Europe, and so on. And there are very conventional expectations that audiences might have. For example, when they walk into an opera, they might expect a certain style of singing and so on. And this is something that we might be able to play with. So how did I localize the genre of opera to something that's very Hong Kong? First of all, I thought about what makes an opera, what makes it work. Is it the structure, the three scenes? Is it the instrumentation? People expect an orchestra, and indeed, my opera has a very tiny orchestra in it. Or is it this performing style of singing and conducting? Or is it just simply a story presented in music? At the same time, I made sure to instill lots of local, very Hong Kong elements into my opera. I'm not writing canto pop, obviously, but here and there is a bit of me that is very signature kind of style in the score. So when I adapted this very local subject for opera, I had to consider what makes a subject good for an operatic work, because in the operatic tradition, it has been predominantly very simple stories, very direct, so that we can focus more on the characters and the expressions, and something very dramatic. And as a result, also a bit abstract and open to interpretation, in comparison to, for example, a film. A film is something where you can present something that is really happening in the world of that film. But in opera, because of the nature of the stage, you cannot do something that's terribly realistic. So there's a level of abstraction involved. And I took advantage of this level of abstraction for more audiences to be able to relate to the tragic characters. And the next question is it just me working on the opera? And obviously it's not, because I worked on the style. I wrote the music and I came up with the story. That's all me. But the libretto is by someone else. It's by a Hong Kong poet who is able to express local sentiments. But they wrote in English, which is their second language, as well as second language of Hong Kong mainstream culture. So it's sort of one filter. And the work during its staging was designed and presented by a crew of predominantly European singers and directors, well, including one Singaporean, but very Western as a whole. And obviously, it's also put on a very European kind of stage, and through the lens of someone well-versed in the operatic tradition. So there are multiple layers of filters. So the question is it a tug of war between what I bring to the table and what other collaborators bring to the table? Or is it an amalgamation of all of that? Do I lose a lot of Hong Kongness in putting in an opera? And does that matter? So that brings me to the next part of my presentation, what this opera means for Hong Kong and for the world. Through the operatic lens, or opera glasses, if you will. So what is the operatic work? Is it the score or is it the show? Because in most of art music, it's the score that represents the work, whereas in pop music, it's mostly the recording or the show. In opera, it's kind of both, because the staging is equally important to the stuff that's in the score itself. So where does the word work exist, and how does it mean anything? Is it meaningful if it's only written and never performed? Is it meaningful if it has a limited reach, such as the 600 views that it currently has, compared to, let's say, 600,000? And does it matter if the performance was true to the score or not? my work places the Hong Kong issue in the long lineage of operas based on real events and people, uh, all the way back to the birth of opera. But more recently, there's something called a Newsreel Opera, which is a genre of operas based on contemporary events, such as John Adams' Nixon in China. That's probably the most well-known one, or might be the first one. A work called Between Worlds about 9/11, and Maryland Forever, which was my inspiration for the work because it was the work that was staged by the Oxford Contemporary Opera Society before this project started. And the reviewer Andrew Porter once said, it might have been the first time, so Nixon in China might have been the first time in the history of opera when some of the characters portrayed on stage could have attended the performance. So, what about my opera? Who's the ones that are portrayed? Because of the design of my opera, it's very abstract and it represents a very wide array of peoples and groups. So you might be one of the people portrayed because, for example, you take a certain stance. So that character on stage represents what you think, your own ideology. So imagine if Nixon went to Nixon in China, it would have been a huge deal for the work itself. So does your action of attending or viewing or commenting on this work, Bou, lend the work more legitimacy? And this work, as a result, inserts the events in Hong Kong into a series of events that have been presented in operas. For example, that visit of Nixon to China. So by putting this event into this lineage, it makes the event, more significant, or it puts it in a list of historically significant events in a certain sense. So, as a result, this opera is also reifying a certain view or certain worldview through abstracting it into an artwork. But the question is, whose perspective is it? Because of the collaborative nature. It's not just me or not just the librettist. It's partly the perspective of the directors or the people who are representing the characters, who express what the characters express. And if you as an audience agree with it or not, does it matter to the perspective of the opera itself? So with opera, traditionally, a work is associated with a composer, for example, Mozart's The Magic Flute. Or on a secondary level, people would say the composer and the librettist. But with something that's so contemporary and relevant, with everything immediately behind me, inspiring the ideas in the work, in a sense, everyone involved in the real events have a perspective, have a say in what the opera says. So is that everyone's perspective as well? And music is only meaningful when it's performed and heard, so it's not just a score. But at the same time, I'm not doing the same thing as, let's say, the so-called international front, because those people present the facts and convince people, such as media or journalists. But as an artist, first of all, I am unable to do the exact same thing. And I decided instead to write an allegory that invites more discussion and ponderance rather than tells people facts and what to think. So if you as an audience, you agree with the message, does it make the opera more significant? Does it further reify this interpretation of these events? What if the opera has an effect on society? And what if it doesn't? Does it matter to the significance of the opera? Because if the opera itself is the work, its significance should be independent of the reach it has. It should just means something in itself, but at the same time, if it reaches more people and more people knows about it, more people thinks about the opera, it could also have concrete significance in society. Before I end the talk, I'd like to talk about some of the symbols in the opera. So in the initial design, I considered having all sorts of symbols on stage: black flags, helmets, raincoats, metal bars, etc. But as the story developed, we had to strike a balance between realism and having a more universal message or storyline, and at the same time, as we had to make some compromises because of the limits of the stage. And indeed, in operatic tradition, directors have often recontextualized their storylines into contemporary or even bizarre situations, such as, I don't know, maybe Mozart in a war zone or something, even though they retain the same music and the same text. So it only affects the visual part of the opera. And this works perfectly with my work because the story itself is abstract. It's, in a sense, presenting a battle of ideologies rather than a battle of people. And the director decided to put it in an office environment, which becomes a way of visualizing these conflicts. And as for certain symbols, we not only retained them, but even incorporated them into the story. For example, raincoats has important meaning to the Hong Kong movement, but inside the story, it also has a very strong symbolic quality. So as the story goes along, more and more sacrifice is made, and every time someone makes a sacrifice, they leave a yellow raincoat on the stage. And as you see the pile up of raincoats, you can feel all the losses, and that has a strong impact on the visuals of the opera. There are also a number of musical symbols in the work, but I can't walk you through all the different musical quotations. What I can say is that a number of melodies are very subtly incorporated into the music, and there's also perhaps one or two slogans that are part of the melody through the use of Cantonese tones. So you will not recognize it right away, but if you sing it with the words, it works. And there is also a number of sections that allude to other musics in real life. For example, Ride's Anthem, which I encourage you to come watch, is an allusion to some real life songs in the movement. So in conclusion, I've talked about the intricate connections between my work and Hong Kong, and between my work and the idea of an opera. And all in all, this work, Bou, through the theme and through the process itself of putting this event into an opera, reaffirms Hong Kong culture as a global culture. And it's a culture that is to be pondered upon through the lens of an art form that is also itself going through globalization. Thank you very much for listening, and please do feel free to ask me questions or talk to me about just anything on Twitter or on my websites. Thank you very much.